If you're not ISO 27001 certified, you may be missing an opportunity to establish security and privacy within your organization, demonstrate trust and assurance to your clientele, and implement and adopt a potential market differentiator in a world where cybersecurity and trust is at the forefront. My name is Ian Terry, and I'm the Senior Director of Cybersecurity Services here at IS Partners. Welcome to the IS Partners podcast. Today, I'm joined by Joe Ciancimino, and we'll be getting into ISO 27001, all about the process for certification, the content of the standard itself, and hopefully navigating and talking about different considerations, gotchas, and answering frequently answered questions for our viewers to help navigate them through the ISO 27001 world. With that, I'd like to get started by introducing Joe Ciancimino. Joe, if you'd like to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background.
Well, first off, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Here at IS Partners, I'm our Senior Director of our Attest Service offering. So I oversee a couple different lines of business here at the firm, including our ISO management certification practice. We recently got accredited as of this past year and have been effectively going through the accreditation process and now really are structuring, building, and vitalizing a practice here to perform these audits. So it's a really exciting time for us as a business, and happy to be here to talk all about management standards and 27001 in particular.
Excellent. So we'll start at a very high level, ISO 27001. We live in a world of acronyms and idiosyncrasies and different names for all these different standards and protocols, et cetera, et cetera. We'll start with the very basic. What is ISO?
Yes, so the International Organization for Standardization. It's kind of funny because the letters don't really align with the acronym, but that is a global organization that creates all different types of management standards. ISO 9001, 27001, 14001, different standards about quality management, information security, environmental concerns, and there are ISO standards for effectively almost everything and anything. Right? You can look up ISO standards for tea leaves and how they're procured and created, right? So, 27001 is obviously very relevant in today's day and age and very popular. The only standard I'd say that's more popular is 9001, which is about quality management systems, very industry specific focuses, right, to that. So we are an information security auditing business, and that's effectively how we kind of got into becoming accredited and now trying to issue these certifications.
Understood. So I think a fair point of comparison might be domestically in the United States, we have the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which very similar establishes standards for all types of different industries, everything from the like standard composition of salt, right, to something like NIST 853, which is a domestic security and privacy standard.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we're finding that ISO standards are very popular globally, but mostly in Europe, right? So a lot of American companies are looking to procure those certifications to operate in Europe. And similarly, a lot of American companies are doing business with European companies and seeing that they have 27001 and using that as a cross comparison point to the forms of third-party assurance they're comfortable with, like SOC 2 or NIST 853 assessments, et cetera. So a lot of moving parts of this kind of like dynamic third-party assurance world we're working in. 27001 is a great management standard, as it really provides a basis and a kind of something binary to compare yourself against, right? And to cross-check yourself against with the Annex A controls and what kind of goes into those assessments. There's a lot of moving parts into getting certified, right? There's a whole implementation process and a process that goes into, navigating an internal audit and a management review and kind of creating what's called your ISMS, your Information Security Management System. Navigating that gives businesses oftentimes a point of a framework effectively, right? To base yourself against, right? Compare your own existing controls against. And that's really the driver for a lot of businesses in getting certified, is having this global standard that is very equitable business to business to understand what kind of information security practices you have in place and communicate that out to whoever it might be, your customers, your regulators, whatever the outside point is looking into your business.
So compared to something like SOC 2 Type 2 or a NIST 853 assessment, ISO 27001 actually allows companies to become certified. Is that true?
That is correct. So the end deliverable and goal of going through this whole life cycle and all this work that goes into the certification audit is an actual certificate, right? That certificate covers a number of different things, right? There's a scope statement that goes on the certificate that really outlines the boundaries of what the certificate covers, as well as, these audits focus a lot inherently on locations, right? And the in-scope locations where this ISMS is being practiced, right? And what management standard and what management system is governing those locations. So that is the end deliverable and goal, is that certificate in hand. The really great part about all of this is that we are accredited through an accreditation body, right? Every certification body that's practicing and issuing these certs is accredited through their relevant certification body in their country, right? Mm-hmm. In the United States, we have a couple different accreditation bodies. There's IAS, there's ANAB, but mostly globally, there is one specific accreditation body in an individual country. And all of these accreditation bodies globally are governed by something called the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum. The International Accreditation Forum has this online certification database where, as a result of being certified by us, that certificate is actually then uploaded. So publicly facing, that your business then has this certificate in place. So it's a global point of comparison to kind of hold everything binary against the same kind of standard across the board. This form of governance over our type of business, a CB, now has this general global landscape where that if you get ISO 27001 certified, that information is the same company to company to company, right? That there's that kind of global point of comparison. And really that's the end goal, right? Is that to have this information available through this one central kind of utility in that search database.
Gotcha. And a company getting this certification and adopting these controls, some of the operational activities it may alleviate within their GRC program is something like navigating vendor risk assessments or meeting different criteria that companies might have for engaging with third parties and vendors from a security and privacy perspective. So I think it would be fair to say that if a company is looking to tap into a European market or an international market and they want to circumvent or alleviate the burden of wondering whether or not they meet certain regulatory requirements or private requirements around security and privacy, getting that ISO 27001 standard would reduce the burden and just be able to grant a greater level of assurance to those potential customers and partners by being able to provide that certificate, really. So that is one of the, at the beginning of our show, I kind of mentioned how an ISO 27001 could serve as a market differentiator and actually a tool for business development, right? Rather than only serving as a means to increase your own security and privacy operations.
For sure. This is not a cost center, right? This is a differentiator and a driver to help our clients really help themselves stand out, right? Differentiate themselves against their competitors in the market and show their commitment to security, which is, as you know, in this day and age, any vendor risk assessment process or any just like procurement process at this point, it's almost standard coming with these kinds of like expectations, right? So having this in hand really does alleviate that for a lot of our customers. Contractually, it's just becoming more and more normalized at this point for this to be a requirement. And so, many people would love to avoid doing this, but that's only going to be able to last so long, right? Kind of having some boundaries like this, and with ISO 27001 being a standardized management standard, right? It does give that kind of basis of, okay, we know and expect what this is going to be, right? It's a very clear kind of deliverable we're seeing our clients necessitate in hand at this point.
Understood. So let's get a little more into the standard itself. So maybe at a high level, you could talk about what it consists of. And namely, I'm thinking we get into, hey, it's made of clauses and Annex A controls, but also maybe if you could illustrate example, maybe one or two from each of those buckets to help illustrate what a company should expect to implement and adopt in order to go through a successful certification activity.
It's a broad list of subject matter, right? But the way you've kind of articulated it in two real big buckets is how I think of the standard as well. There are, number one, the clause documentation that's going to be necessary. And it's not just documentation, these are practices, right? That are kind of expected for you to be living in day in and day out, right? The clauses outline a whole bunch of different areas, how you're contextualizing and understanding the needs of your internal and external interested parties, what the risk management process looks like, not only from just like identifying clear risk to your business, right? Not even just from an information security standpoint, but at the entity level as well, but then accepting those risks. What type of support mechanisms are in place for the ISMS, right? Who's governing and monitoring the information security management system? And then a couple of key particulars that are definitely always come up as part of these engagements are the need for an internal audit, right? So the requirement 9.2 in the standard actually points to the need to internally audit the system, as well as a management review, right? That should be occurring at least annually, where management actually needs to be meeting and discussing the ISMS, right? Understanding its needs, understanding its boundaries and expectations. These are some of the arching governance components to the standard, right? Bucket number 2 of the standard is something called the Annex A controls. 93 Annex A controls. Typically, businesses have what's called a statement of applicability, right? And that statement of applicability goes through all 93 of those. And, it's actually a requirement in order to be certified. You have to justify the inclusion or exclusion of those controls as part of going through the certification audit and the Annex A controls.
So you can actually tailor which controls actually apply to your assessment based on your own interpretation of that applicability.
100%. That being designated, of course, on your ISMS scope, right? So that part of the clauses is outlining the boundaries of the scope of your ISMS, and the applicability of the controls, of course, could be non-existent if it didn't make sense for that scope, right? You're talking about a certain business unit where development isn't outsourced. Well, there's a clear and particular control in the Annex A controls where application development is, monitoring of those outsourced efforts. That might not make sense for every business, right? Maybe you're just not outsourcing application development. And so that Annex A control, you could provide that justification as to what you are and aren't doing from a development standpoint, and then exclude if necessary, right? Ultimately, these are kind of like the expectations of management to be going through as they head into their certification audit. Of course, it makes sense to speak with a certification auditor about these types of nuances and make sure that you're getting clear kind of like expectations and boundaries of what's going to go into the engagement, right?
Understood. And from a Annex A control perspective, so just to kind of re-summarize that, the clauses, the front part of that standard, if that makes sense, that is where you've got your more governance level requirements. And that is actually also where most of the requirements that are almost like ISO 27001 specific really live. Whereas the Annex A controls, those are where those practical types of controls and requirements exist, right?
Exactly
Things
right.
like antivirus and logging and monitoring, right? So the very common concepts and requirements across a variety of frameworks. That's where you're going to see your Annex A controls. So I'm sure we would both advise that when approaching ISO, it's very likely that your company already has a lot of those Annex A controls met or in place. It's really where on the clause side is where you'll probably need a little more attention around documentation, maybe adding some more governance processes and activities, because both are equally important in the context of the actual certification assessment itself.
100%. And, we've used this term a few times, management standard, right? And the management component of that is a big part of undergoing these assessments, right? 27001 might be an information security management standard, but it is still a management standard, and that's ultimately the goal. It's toned from the top, right? With the Annex A controls in particular, too, I think one of the nuances is that many folks, I think, often look at this as an IT audit, IT security specific assessment, but the clauses the Annex A controls cover a lot of different subject matter, right? It's not just technological controls, right? There are the organizational controls, the people controls, physical controls, and then the technological controls. So things like non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality agreements and the physical access controls, CCTV cameras, cabling security. There's a whole lot of different subject matter you're going to have to be assessed on, right? And so it really is kind of broad and kind of its expanse of what you're going to be expected. That being said, they're fairly commonplace business practices that most people do have in place, but they just need to, make sure that you have a lot of these kind of practices formalized in a lot of ways, right? And I think that is the ultimate step that it takes to get certified is the formalization of your internal process and what you have, right, in order to kind of necessitate going through an audit, right? So we see this challenge all the time as auditors for anything, right?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely we do. So let's so we've kind of covered the standard itself. We talked a lot about the context. We've broken down clauses versus Annex A controls. A few more topics I want to get into as we kind of navigate the life cycle of ISO 27001. You had brought up a concept a little earlier, internal audit. Maybe you could do a quick discussion around that.
Sure. So, I mean, requirement 9.2 doesn't get actually too much into the particular details of what the expectation is of an internal audit. However, you know, we typically advise our clients to be going through this at least annually, right? And, you know, ultimately it is management's responsibility to be, you know, the whole thing is structured to be a constant form of continuous improvement. There's a term we use that are called non-conformities, right? These are non-conformances with the standard itself, right? And those are the sources of non-conformities should not only be coming from us, the auditors, right? But effectively, it's really the goal of the standard that management is continuously kind of monitoring themselves through a function like internal audit, and then identifying their own non-conformities with the standard that they are then remediating on an ongoing basis. So,
gotcha. So it would be wise for a company that's looking to adopt ISO 27001 and obtain an ISO 27001 certification to map out for that internal audit activity to be performed to identify those gaps and those nonconformities before actually entering into the certification audit itself, really for two reasons. Not only so they make sure that they've adopted all of those controls adequately, but also because that internal audit function itself is a requirement of the ISO standard.
Yes, 100%. You nailed it right on the head, right? Really, you know, that is going to be a necessity. And it is one of the biggest points that's brought up in stage one of the audit, which is, you know, the existence of these kind of like greater activities, right? The internal audit, the management review, et cetera.
Okay. Awesome. I'm glad you mentioned those stages because, again, going through the life cycle, we've talked about the standard, talked about that internal audit, right? A requirement. And one comment I'll add there, that internal audit, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Joe, but it does to some degree indicate that that internal audit is performed with some degree of competency, but also independence. Many companies are familiar with the internal audit function within an organization is probably an adequate resource to apply to that. But also a lot of companies, specifically our clients, like to work with us on that internal audit side because they may not have that level of independence reserved internally for an activity like that, or they just may feel that they don't have the internal subject matter expertise to interpret that ISO 27001 standard to yield a fruitful and reliable internal audit activity.
Yep. Yeah, you're 100% spot on. One of the things here, obviously, because we are certifiers as well, we don't perform the same activities ourselves, right? If we're doing internal audit activities. So we obviously draw a hard line in the sand there where if a client's doing internal audit work with us, we certainly don't certify as well. And you brought up two very particular points, right, about the requirements. Number one, of evaluating the competency of your internal auditors, as well as the independence functionality with that, because it is still an audit, right? That's still the expectation of the internal audit. It is not consultancy, right? And that's a very particular type of functioning inside of a business that has to be navigated away from when you talk about these management standards, right? You're being assessed, you're being audited, you're identifying nonconformities. There's this form of ongoing monitoring and improvement to the standard or to the system. So those are really kind of important nuances and bits to how you should be interpreting and understanding the standard itself.
Understood. So let's jump ahead then to the certification audit itself, right? And that's also a service we provide. You mentioned it was broken up into phases.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about it because this actually hasn't come up yet. So the certification process is actually a 3-year rolling cycle, right?
Oh, right.
So in year one of going through this, you've never received an ISO 27001 certificate before. You perform what's called an initial audit. Initial audits come in 2 stages. Stage 1 and stage 2. So stage 1 is typically a shorter assessment where basically there's a lot of discovery occurring, right? You're discovering, the auditor's discovering about the system. They're discovering the scoping information that we received through the application that's been submitted. We're discovering everything and anything about the current management's current understanding of the requirements, the internal audit, the management review, etc. So that stage 1 audit is really there to serve as the baseline for kind of the expectations for stage 2. When we perform stage 1 audits, we don't identify nonconformities ourselves. We simply identify areas of concern. Mm-hmm. And that's a key bit, as, you know, if any unpreparedness, for lack of a better word, existed during the stage 1, we would be able to identify that quickly to give management the kind of boundaries and expectations heading into stage 2. Stage 2, typically a lot longer of an assessment, where really you're diving into the weeds of anything and everything. We're performing sampling, we're inspecting, doing observation, we're looking through policies, procedures, we are looking through the management system standards and documentation that's been put together, and really just diving into anything and everything surrounding management's conformity to the standard. Saying all goes well, we do identify, of course, nonconformities as a result of the assessment. And management's kind of given boundaries and expectations on when those nonconformities need to be addressed and remediated, and they have to actually identify their root causes of how they believe those nonconformities came about. Following year 1, right, at that point, hopefully our client has been certified. We issue certification. It gets uploaded to the IAF search database that we mentioned earlier. And then in years 2 and year 3, you perform what are called surveillance audits. And those surveillance audits really are there to surveillance the fact that the management system is still there, right? There is still testing and sampling done in those surveillance years, but the expectation is less audit time, right? There's less needs to be kind of addressed. If we're doing a multi-location audit, let's say, we have to sample less locations, let's say, during surveillance years. So the barometer is lowered in those surveillance years, really to, you know, allow for the management system to kind of live and breathe and do its thing. We still could, of course, identify nonconformities during surveillance audits, and really that's kind of your annual cycle there, right? Every year you're kind of identifying new issues or challenges that may exist, right? And those are brought together by management and then kind of tracked and remediated until they've been addressed. In year 4, right, you've gone through this 3-year cycle. It's not an initial audit you're doing now. You're doing what's called a recertification audit, where effectively it serves a lot of the same roles as stage 2. We just don't have to really do that same discovery anymore over the management system, as we kind of believe and understand the system at this point, right? So you are required to effectively recertify every 3 years. And that's the general layout and framework for how the certification process works. Obviously, there are a lot of moving parts, but to that extent, you can kind of expect that it's going to be a 3-year moving cycle over time.
And how long would you say, like, once a customer has engaged with us for a certification audit, how many days of effort would they expect to undergo, and what is the time frame in which they can complete both of those phases?
It's highly variable, is what I'd say. A lot will depend on how big of a business, how complex of a business we're talking about. Not only the complexity of the IT stack, but also the complexity of just what the business operations does as a business. So there are a lot of moving parts as far as like how we kind of come up with that audit time calculation, and what's going to be necessary from an audit time standpoint. It's all formulaic, right? So everything that we do is in alignment with 27006, which actually provides boundaries for how audit time is calculated. We do a fairly intensive kind of scoping exercise on the front end before a client engages with us, so we can lay the boundaries and expectations for audit time. That being said, of course, there's time in advance of even engaging with us, right, that clients have to go through to implement everything. And, you know, that'll be highly variable, of course, depending on the business, right? We definitely do recommend working with consultancies if that is something that you need, right? We have a consultancy here in group, IMSM, and they help a lot of clients get ready for ISO 27001 certification audits. So a lot of moving parts. You know, I'd say you're looking at, you know, ultimately end to end, you decide today, we need to become ISO 27001 certified. Probably going to be 3-4 months before you really have achieved that certificate in hand. Maybe faster, maybe longer, right? A lot will kind of depend on your aptitude your appetite to really get the work done, right? Put this system in place, and kind of what the boundaries and scope you currently have in place are, right?
Sure.
If you're a business that's gone through several audits in the past, you may be more comfortable heading into this quicker, right? While if you've never gone through any form of audit before, it might take you longer. I think what's mostly the key to success for our clients is when we're spoken to sooner, right? When we hear from people sooner about their journey and understand kind of where they're at, we help to kind of give them the right tools and utilities in advance of really going through this audit, whether that's introductions to partners, introductions to other consultancies, or introductions to whoever might make sense to guidance points, right? Sometimes we point people directly to where they can download the standard, right? Purchase it, right? They may not know, right? And so it's helpful when we start to have those kinds of discovery conversations to really lay out the roadmap and journey for them to help them kind of get to that end finish goal. Right?
Sure. Understood. And in my experience, I tend to see for those certification audits in which I've participated, usually the audit itself is performed within like a 45-day, maybe even a 30-day window, with maybe half a week allocated to that phase one and a full week allocated to that phase two, with those activities kind of bookending each part of that month or 45-day window. Now, again, to Joe's point, it's all variable. It's based on the complexity of the environment being audited. But that's just kind of generally where I see those things.
That is a fairly typical, I'd say, type of 27001 certification audit, right? That's fairly commonplace kind of expectation.
Gotcha. But to your point, that's not to say, you can get ISO in 30 to 45 days. Joe also articulated, and what I tend to see is something like a 90 plus day lead time worth of activities to cover that internal audit, that internal education about ISO 20. Should you identify any OFIs or AOCs or nonconformities during that internal audit activity, you also want to bake in some time to remediate those before actually heading into the phase one.
100%. And, we never want to really be giving the implication that this is ever going to be easy, right? There's a lot of moving parts to go in through this process. We really encourage our clients to do their due diligence, right? Make sure they're feeling the aptitude to necessitate and get this done, and take it seriously, right? Because it is an undertaking, right? And we feel really confident in our capabilities to provide a great experience for our customers. But there's a two-sided kind of equation there, where for the clients that have gotten to the finish line, they really take a look back at kind of where their starting point was at, and see a transformative process kind of occurred, right, from the beginning landscape.
So one of my last questions here, as someone advising some of the companies out there, maybe some of our viewers, what are some of the attributes in a certification entity should they be looking for when navigating, choosing a certification entity to audit their own ISO program, and with the hope of obtaining the certification? One obvious one comes to mind for me is whether or not the company's name starts with I and ends with S Partners. But besides that one in particular, anything that you would advise our clients to look out for?
There are two very key components that are constantly articulated throughout any management standard, which is competence and impartiality. And I'd say take those two bits very seriously, right? Evaluate the competency of your auditors, evaluate how much they really can speak through your tech stack, how much can they really speak through kind of the work that needs to be done, right? And articulate themselves well through kind of like the expectations and boundaries of what you're going into.
With that, I think we'll probably conclude there. Joe, thank you very much for joining me on the show. To our viewers, you can learn more about IS Partners, learn more about myself and Joe on our website at www.ispartnersllc.com. If there is any further questions or inquiries, or if you're curious about our ISO program or anything else that we offer, please reach out to us via the website or directly by emailing myself or Joe Ciancimino. Our contact information is definitely out there somewhere. So anyway, thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next time.